Hello, beautiful soul. I'm Aurora, and welcome to Twin Flame Journey, a space where we explore the deeper meaning behind soul connections, divine timing, and the path that leads two hearts back to union. If you've been feeling the signs, you're in the right place.
What if union does not begin when he comes back, but when something inside him finally stops resisting the truth? What if the final step before divine masculine union is not external at all? Not a message, not a meeting, not a confession, not even a visible return, but an invisible inner shift. A shift where the old self can no longer survive, where fear no longer feels stronger than love, where avoidance no longer feels safer than honesty, where the man who kept running from vulnerability realizes he is no longer running from her. He is running from the version of himself that sacred union requires him to become. Because that is the truth almost nobody talks about. The final inner shift before union is not just emotional. It is spiritual, psychological, energetic. It is the collapse of the last defense, the surrender of the last illusion, the moment the divine masculine stops asking how to protect himself and starts asking how to become true enough to hold what his soul has always known was sacred. So what is that final shift? Why does it often happen after the pain, after the silence, after the identity collapse, after the old coping mechanisms stop working? Why does he seem to change only when something inside him breaks open for real? And how do you know when he is no longer just missing union, but actually becoming ready for it? In this video, we're going deep into the final inner shift before divine masculine union, the sacred turning point where longing becomes truth, fear loses its throne, and the masculine finally begins choosing alignment over self-protection. Chapter 1: Why union is not just an outer event. Most people think union begins when something visible happens. A message, a return, a conversation, a confession, a reunion that finally puts form around everything that has been felt in silence for so long. But sacred union does not begin there. It begins earlier, deeper, invisibly. It begins in the inner world of the divine masculine long before the outer story catches up. And this is one of the most important truths to understand if you want to truly grasp the final inner shift before union. Union is not first an outer event. It is an inner alignment. That means a man can be physically close and still not be in union. He can return outwardly and still be inwardly divided. He can say the right words and still not be able to hold the truth those words require. Because union is not just about proximity. It is about congruence. It is about what happens when the inner world and the outer world stop moving in opposite directions. It is about what happens when what he feels, what he knows, and how he lives begin to come into alignment. It is about the moment the divine masculine can no longer tolerate being one person in silence and another in action. That is why the final shift before union is so sacred. Because it is not simply, he comes back. It is, he becomes someone who can stop abandoning truth. And that change begins on the inside. For a long time, the divine masculine may already know the connection is real. He may feel it in his body, in his thoughts, in the way no ordinary distraction fully replaces what this bond awakened in him. He may ache, remember, miss, compare, regret, long, and still find himself returning inwardly to the same soul recognition again and again. But inner recognition is not the same as inner union. That is the difficult part. Because a man can recognize love and still be split against it. He can know what matters and still live as if fear matters more. He can feel the sacredness of the connection and still remain loyal to the old self that does not know how to hold sacred things without running from them. So before union becomes something outer, something inner has to change. He must stop treating the truth as something he can feel privately but delay publicly. He must stop living in contradiction. He must stop allowing his soul to know one thing while his defenses keep building another reality around him. That is why this first chapter matters so much. Because many people focus too much on signs in the external world. They look for movement, contact, action, return, visible softening, outer indicators that the path is progressing. And those things matter, yes, but they are not the deepest level. The deepest level is whether the masculine is becoming inwardly aligned enough to sustain what he may have wanted for a very long time. That is the real question. Not only does he miss union, but is he becoming internally ready for it? These are not the same. A man can miss union and still resist it. He can long for closeness and still sabotage closeness. He can feel profound spiritual love and still let pride, fear, control, or silence rule the way he responds to it. Why? Because union is not only about loving someone. It is about becoming someone capable of living in the truth of that love. And that is inner work. It is the work of identity, of conscience, of emotional maturity, of nervous system change, of spiritual surrender, of letting the old masculine self lose power over a heart that is asking to become more honest. This is why the outer story often looks delayed, because the soul is still working inside him. The outer return may not happen until the inward war has reached a point where he can no longer remain divided the way he once did. The visible movement may not come until something invisible breaks, until fear loses its throne, until the old strategies stop feeling wise, until the man who once protected himself through distance begins realizing that distance is no longer peace. That is the hidden preparation for union, and it is often invisible to everyone but him. He may still look quiet on the outside, still look hesitant, still look like nothing is happening, but inwardly, an enormous shift may already be underway. Because sacred change often happens in secret first, in sleepless nights, in moments of unexpected grief, in the quiet collapse of old self-explanations, in the realization that the life built around emotional control no longer satisfies the soul, in the dawning awareness that what he once called self-protection has become self-betrayal. These are inner events, and inner events are where union begins. That may sound surprising, especially in a world that measures everything by visible proof. But spiritual truths rarely work that way. The most important movements often begin in silence, in conscience, in identity shift, in the hidden dismantling of what was false. That is why the divine masculine can seem unchanged for a long time, then suddenly appear different. Because the visible change may only be the surface of a much deeper invisible process. The process of becoming internally available to what his soul has long known. This is what makes union so much more than romance. Romance may be part of it. Return may be part of it. Communication may be part of it. But union at its deepest is inner agreement. Agreement between the heart and the life. Agreement between love and action. Agreement between what he knows and how he chooses. Agreement between the soul and the self. And until that agreement begins forming inside him, outer union remains unstable, even if contact happens. This is why some people can come back outwardly and still not truly be ready. Because the inner split is still active. The longing may be there, but so is the loyalty to fear. The love may be real, but so is the dependence on control. The connection may be undeniable, but the self entering it is still organized around defense. That is not union yet. That is proximity without alignment. And proximity without alignment cannot hold sacred love for long. This is why the final inner shift matters more than almost anything else. Because it is the difference between a man reaching outward and a man becoming inwardly whole enough to stop reaching from contradiction. That difference changes everything. Imagine a man standing at the door of union. He can see it. He can feel it. He may even want it desperately. But if he is still inwardly divided, then the very thing he longs for will also terrify him. He will approach and retreat, open and close, long and resist, because the war inside him has not ended. But once something changes internally, once the inner war begins losing its power, then the outer path becomes possible in a completely different way. Now he does not just want union. He wants truth more than he wants self-protection. That is the beginning. Because self-protection is what kept him fragmented. Truth is what begins integrating him. The old self says, stay safe, stay guarded, stay uncertain, stay one step back. The awakening self begins saying, I cannot keep living like this. I cannot keep dividing myself from what I know matters. I cannot keep protecting the old self more than I honor the truth. That is inner union beginning. Not with the other person first. With himself. With the part of him that knows. With the part of him that feels. With the part of him that no longer wants to keep using silence as shelter. With the part of him that is tired of living against his own soul. This is why so many final shifts before union feel less like romance and more like reckoning. Because before the masculine can truly meet sacred union outwardly, he has to stop being internally split from the life it requires. He has to stop making peace with contradiction. He has to stop asking love to remain alive while he keeps feeding the patterns that wound it. That is why union starts inside. Not because the outer story does not matter, but because the outer story cannot hold what the inner structure still rejects. This is the profound spiritual law beneath the whole journey. Outer union is sustained by inner congruence. Not by intensity alone. Not by longing alone. Not by signs alone. By congruence. A man whose soul knows one thing, and whose life keeps serving another will suffer until that split becomes too painful to maintain. That suffering is not punishment. It is preparation. It is the soul pressing him toward an inner honesty strong enough to eventually create outer movement that is no longer built on contradiction. And that is why this chapter is the right place to begin. Because before we talk about the final shift itself, we have to understand the ground it stands on. Union is not just when he returns. It is when the part of him that resisted truth loses enough power that the soul can finally lead. That is the real beginning. And once you understand that, everything about the journey looks different. The silence becomes less simple. The delays become more revealing. The inner pain becomes more meaningful. The eventual outer shift becomes more sacred, because you understand it did not start with a message. It started with an invisible surrender. A surrender that may have happened in tears no one saw. In nights no one witnessed. In conscience no one could measure. In the quiet death of the version of him that could feel sacred love and still try to live outside of it. That death is where union begins. Not at the end of the story. At the beginning of the real one. Because the moment a man begins aligning inwardly with what his soul has always known, the outer world is no longer carrying the whole burden of change. Now the deepest movement is already underway. And that is the first truth of the final inner shift before divine masculine union. He does not become ready when something finally happens outside of him. He becomes ready when something finally stops lying inside of him. Chapter 2: The old self can feel the connection, but cannot sustain union. One of the most painful truths on this path is this. The old self can feel the connection, and still not be able to hold union. That is why the final inner shift is necessary. Because feeling is not the problem. The divine masculine often feels far more than he admits. Far more than he knows how to explain. Far more than his outer behavior may suggest. He can recognize her energy. He can feel the pull. He can sense the sacredness of the bond. He can think about her constantly, miss her in silence, compare everyone else to what he felt with her, and still remain trapped inside the same old defenses that once helped him survive. This is the contradiction. The old self is not incapable of love. It is incapable of sustaining truth. That is the difference. Because the old self was built around protection. Protection from being too exposed. Too vulnerable. Too emotionally dependent. Too affected. Too open to the possibility of losing control. So even when love is real, the old self interprets that reality through fear. Love becomes danger. Connection becomes pressure. Vulnerability becomes instability. Truth becomes something that threatens the carefully managed identity he has built around strength, silence, restraint, and self-containment. That is why the old self can absolutely feel union approaching and still resist it. Not because the connection is false, but because the self trying to receive it is still organized around avoidance. This is what so many people misunderstand. They assume that if he truly feels the bond, he should naturally move toward it. They assume spiritual recognition automatically creates readiness. But recognition and readiness are not the same. A man can know what matters and still not yet be capable of living according to that knowing. Why? Because the old self is not designed for sacred intimacy. It is designed for survival. And survival is very different from union. Survival says, stay guarded, stay measured, stay one step back. Do not show too much. Do not let anyone matter so much that you lose your center. Do not make choices that require your heart to become more visible than your image. But union asks for the opposite. It asks for presence, for honesty, for vulnerability without collapse, for consistency without masks, for the courage to stop hiding behind distance, confusion, or control. That is why the old self can want union and still sabotage it. Because wanting love and being able to hold love are two different stages of consciousness. A man may want closeness, but if the old self still equates closeness with exposure, he will instinctively resist the very thing he longs for. A man may deeply love, but if the old self still relies on silence as safety, he will keep withholding the truth that love requires. A man may feel sacred recognition, but if the old self is still built around pride, fear, and emotional management, then sacred recognition becomes something he experiences inwardly while contradicting it outwardly. This is the agony of the pre-union masculine journey. He is touched by something real, but the self living inside that reality is still incomplete. That is why the old self can feel the connection and still create distance. Not because the distance is stronger than the love, but because the structure of the self is still stronger than the courage to fully embody the love. This chapter matters because it explains why the masculine often appears so contradictory. He may feel a soul-level pull yet still go silent. He may know the connection is different yet still delay. He may be deeply changed internally, yet still remain outwardly inconsistent. Why? Because the old self is trying to interpret sacred love through an outdated system. And outdated systems cannot sustain union. Think about it this way. If a man has built his identity around emotional control, then a connection that makes him feel deeply is not only attractive, it is destabilizing. If he has learned to trust logic more than tenderness, then a soul bond that awakens deep emotional truth is not only beautiful, it is threatening. If he has survived through self-protection, then union does not just offer love. It demands transformation. And transformation is what the old self resists. The old self does not want to die quietly. It wants to be right. It wants to remain in charge. It wants to keep calling its fear wisdom, its silence space, its control maturity, and its hesitation timing. But sacred union exposes all of that. Because union is too honest for a false structure. It will show him where he still hides, where he still withholds, where he still confuses emotional suppression with strength, where he still wants the beauty of connection without the cost of becoming someone who can sustain it. That is why the old self cannot hold union. Not because it is evil, because it is limited. It was built to prevent overwhelm, not to create wholeness. It was built to avoid collapse, not to embody truth. It was built to function in fear, not to rest in sacred intimacy. This deserves compassion, because the old self often formed for good reasons. Maybe he learned early that his emotions were too much. Maybe he learned that vulnerability made him unsafe. Maybe he learned to equate love with instability, need with weakness, openness with loss of power. So he adapted. He became harder to read, more controlled, more distant, more self-contained, more skilled at looking calm even when his inner world was anything but calm. That adaptation may have helped him survive. But now the question changes. Now the question is not, did this self help me survive? Now the question becomes, can this self carry me into sacred union without distorting it? And the answer most of the time is no. Because sacred union asks the masculine to be seen. Not just admired. Not just desired. Seen. It asks him to tell the truth. To stop making silence his first language of safety. To stop hiding behind emotional distance when something sacred requires presence. To stop expecting the connection to survive indefinitely while he remains loyal to the self that keeps interrupting it. That is why the final inner shift comes so late and so painfully for many men. Because the old self must become unbearable before it will truly step down. As long as it still seems impressive, he will keep serving it. As long as it still seems wise, he will keep defending it. As long as it still offers enough temporary relief, he will keep trusting it. But eventually the connection, the pain, the emptiness, the contradiction, and the spiritual pressure all begin revealing the same truth. This version of me cannot carry what my soul is asking for. That realization is devastating. Because now he is not only missing union, he is grieving the self that cannot hold it. He begins seeing that the problem was never simply whether love was real. Love may have been real all along. The deeper issue was whether the structure of his inner world could sustain the reality of that love without falling back into fear. This is the humbling truth. The old self may have been able to visit the connection. Think about it. Ache for it. Dream of it. Even reach toward it in moments. But it could not live there steadily. It could not stay. And that is why the final shift before union is not only about emotion. It is about capacity. The old self lacks that capacity. It may feel deeply, but still not know how to stay grounded in vulnerability. It may want truth, but still prefer control. It may long for closeness, but still use avoidance whenever closeness becomes too real. So yes, the old self can feel the connection. Sometimes intensely. But intensity alone does not create union. Union asks for an inner structure that is no longer ruled by self-protection. An inner structure that can remain present when the emotional stakes are high. An inner structure that does not panic every time sacred love asks for honesty, tenderness, and embodied truth. That is why the old self must eventually crack. Not because it was worthless. Because it has reached its limit. And this is where the divine masculine often feels such deep inner conflict. Part of him already knows the bond is sacred. Part of him may already ache for truth. But the old self still keeps trying to interpret that ache through fear. Still keeps trying to fit the soul into the rules of a life built around defense. That split becomes unbearable over time. And when it becomes unbearable enough, awakening deepens. Because now the question is no longer, do I feel this? Now the question is, what in me cannot hold what I feel? That is the sacred question of this chapter. And the answer is not always simple. It may be fear of vulnerability, fear of emotional exposure, fear of losing control, fear of not being enough, fear of the inner collapse required to become more real. But whatever the answer is, one thing becomes clear. The old self is not built for union. It is built for distance from pain. And sacred union asks for closeness to truth. Those are different worlds. That is why the final inner shift must happen. Because the masculine cannot step into true union as a more poetic version of the same defended self. He cannot decorate avoidance with spiritual language and expect it to sustain a bond that was meant to awaken his deepest honesty. He cannot keep protecting the old identity and still fully enter the life his soul is calling him toward. Something has to give. Something has to soften. Something has to die. Something has to stop being admired simply because it once kept him safe. And maybe that is the deepest truth of all. The old self was never the enemy. It was the shelter. But sacred union is what happens when the soul finally says, I can no longer live in the shelter if it keeps me from the truth. That is the beginning of the final inner shift. Because from there, the masculine is no longer just feeling the connection. He is beginning to understand why feeling it is not enough. He must become someone new. And that realization, though painful, is the very thing that brings union closer than ever before. Chapter 3: What finally stops working. There comes a moment on the divine masculine journey when the old strategies begin to fail all at once. Not dramatically at first. Not always in a way anyone else can see. But inside him, something begins to break. The distance no longer brings peace. The silence no longer feels powerful. The logic no longer explains enough. The avoidance no longer protects him from what the soul is trying to say. And that is when the final inner shift begins approaching. Because as long as the old strategies still seem to work, the old self remains in control. He may still feel pain, yes. Still miss the connection, yes. Still sense that something sacred is happening, yes. But if the familiar defenses continue offering even a small amount of relief, he can keep repeating them. He can keep stepping back. Keep delaying. Keep intellectualizing. Keep calling emotional distance space, control, wisdom, silence, stability. But eventually something changes. What once soothed him starts exhausting him. What once made him feel safe starts making him feel empty. What once looked like strength starts looking like fear. That is what finally stops working. And this is one of the deepest thresholds before divine masculine union. Because the old self does not step down while it still believes it can save him. It only begins collapsing when it can no longer convincingly offer peace. That is the key. The old strategies stop delivering what they promised. For a long time, distance may have felt like relief. If he stepped back from the intensity, he could breathe. If he created emotional separation, the pressure softened just enough for him to return to familiar ground. If he stayed in the mind, in routine, in control, he could temporarily avoid the deeper truth. But then the deeper truth becomes harder to contain. Now distance creates ache. Silence creates heaviness. Routine feels flat. Distraction wears off faster. The old identity starts feeling like a structure he is trapped inside, rather than a structure that protects him. That is when the masculine begins realizing, even if he cannot fully explain it yet, that the life built around avoidance is no longer sustainable for the soul. This phase can feel terrifying because the old strategies were not random. They were intelligent adaptations. They helped him survive emotional realities he did not know how to process any other way. They allowed him to function, to stay composed, to keep life moving without having to fully confront the inner world. So when those strategies fail, it is not just a bad day emotionally. It is a collapse of trust. He begins losing trust in the very things he relied on to stay regulated. He may still try them. He may withdraw again. Stay quiet again. Double down on logic. Tell himself he just needs more time, more distance, less pressure. But something inside him now knows these are no longer real answers. And that knowing is deeply destabilizing. Because if distance is no longer peace, then what is peace? If silence is no longer strength, then what is strength? If control no longer stabilizes him, then what is he supposed to stand on now? These are not simple questions. They shake identity. Because for many divine masculines, the old strategies were not just behaviors. They were extensions of self. Ways of defining what it meant to be safe, masculine, rational, mature, and in control. If those things begin losing power, he is not only losing methods. He is losing certainty. That is why this chapter matters so much. Because before the final inner shift, there is usually a phase where what once kept him asleep no longer works well enough to keep him there. The soul becomes louder than the coping. Not always in a spiritual, polished way. Sometimes in a very human way. Through restlessness. Through emptiness. Through emotional fatigue. Through the return of memories he cannot suppress. Through the ache of almost loss. Through the unbearable feeling that what he has been calling stability is no longer alive enough to hold him. This is where the masculine often becomes internally more unstable before he becomes more honest. Because when the old strategies fail, there is an in-between. He cannot fully go back. He does not yet know how to move forward. He cannot return to unconsciousness comfortably. He does not yet know how to live in alignment with the truth pressing on him. That in-between can feel brutal. He may feel more agitated, more inwardly split, more aware of contradiction, more unable to find true relief in the places that used to provide temporary control. That is not failure. It is revelation. The old self is being shown its limit, and limits are humbling. For a man who has relied on silence, it is humbling to realize silence no longer saves him from the ache. For a man who trusted logic, it is humbling to realize logic cannot protect him from the body's grief, from the soul's insistence, from the emotional consequence of what he has avoided. For a man who built strength through distance, it is humbling to realize distance has become loneliness. This is why the pre-union phase often carries so much unseen tension. From the outside, it may still look like he is withdrawn, quiet, uncertain, slow to act. But inwardly, a war is often ending. Not because he suddenly understands everything, but because he can no longer believe in the old defenses the same way. This is one of the most important hidden shifts. The old self starts losing innocence. Before, distance felt justified. Now it feels costly. Before, silence felt neutral. Now it feels heavy. Before, delay felt reasonable. Now it feels like betrayal of something his soul can no longer call small. That is what finally stops working. Not only the behavior itself, the belief in the behavior. And once belief begins collapsing, the whole internal architecture starts changing. Because people do not keep choosing the same defense forever when that defense begins producing more pain than relief. At some point, the psyche turns on what once protected it, not out of cruelty, but out of evolution. The soul begins refusing the arrangement. It begins saying, I cannot keep living in this structure and still become what I am meant to become. That refusal is the beginning of the final shift. It may feel like panic at first, or grief, or disorientation, or emotional heaviness, or the strange sensation of being tired of being yourself in the way you have known yourself. That last one is especially sacred, because one of the clearest signs that the old strategies are finished is this. He becomes tired of the man he has been while using them, tired of being the one who always steps back, tired of silence as identity, tired of control as religion, tired of explaining away what his heart keeps trying to make undeniable, tired of the gap between what he knows inwardly and how he keeps living outwardly. That exhaustion is holy, because exhaustion with the old self often comes right before surrender. Not surrender in the dramatic sense. Surrender in the deep sense. The sense of no longer wanting to keep protecting what is false. No longer wanting to keep worshiping what is familiar, just because it is familiar. No longer wanting to build a life around strategies that keep him half safe and half alive. That is when the final inner shift becomes possible. Because until the old strategies lose authority, the masculine has no real reason to let go of them. But once they stop working, once they stop bringing relief, once they start feeling like the very source of the emptiness, then something else begins calling him more powerfully than fear. Truth. Not just truth about the connection. Truth about himself. Truth about how tired he is of running. Truth about how little control has actually healed. Truth about how much of his life has been organized around not having to feel deeply. Truth about how the soul can no longer remain content in structures built by fear. This is what makes Chapter 3 such a critical turning point. Because the final inner shift does not begin when the old strategies are still impressive. It begins when they become intolerable. When he can no longer call them wisdom with a straight face. When he can no longer lean on them without feeling the deadness they create. When they stop being his rescue and start becoming the cage. That is what finally stops working. And maybe that is the deeper mystery of the divine masculine path. He does not always change when he first sees the truth. He changes when everything he used to do to avoid that truth stops protecting him from it. That is when the inner world begins opening. That is when the soul gets louder than the defense. That is when union moves closer, not because something romantic has happened yet, but because the false self has begun losing its final argument. And once a man loses faith in the old ways of staying asleep, the only direction left is awakening. Chapter for the final shift begins when he stops running from himself. For a long time, it may have looked like the divine masculine was running from the connection, running from intimacy, from love, from the mirror of the divine feminine, from the emotional pressure of sacred union. And on the surface, that is partly true. But deeper than that, he was running from himself. That is the real shift almost nobody talks about. Because the final inner shift before divine masculine union does not begin the moment he stops resisting another person. It begins the moment he can no longer keep running from his own heart, his own grief, his own fear, his own tenderness, his own truth. That is where awakening becomes irreversible. Up until that point, he may still tell himself the issue is external. The timing, the pressure, the intensity. the circumstances, the complexity of the connection, the uncertainty of what would happen if he opened too much, too soon, too honestly. But when the final shift begins, something deeper becomes undeniable. The hardest thing he has been avoiding was never only her. It was what she awakened in him. The parts of himself he buried. The needs he learned to silence. The vulnerability he learned to call weakness. The emotional truth he kept at a distance because distance felt safer than being fully changed. That is why the final shift begins with self-confrontation. Not polished spiritual self-awareness. Not romantic realization. Not a sudden wave of clarity that makes everything easy. Self-confrontation. The kind that strips excuses. The kind that brings him face to face with the fact that he has not only been protecting himself from pain, he has been protecting himself from truth. And truth, once it gets strong enough, becomes impossible to keep calling too much. This is what makes the phase so sacred and so painful. Because when a man stops running from himself, he loses the old comfort of projection. He can no longer say, "This is only because of her. This is only because the connection is intense. This is only because life is complicated." Now he has to ask, why does this touch me so deeply? Why does distance no longer feel like peace? Why does my silence feel heavier than before? Why does the version of me that once felt safe now feel incomplete, tired, false? Those questions change everything. Because now he is no longer looking outward for the source of his unrest. He is turning inward. And inward is where the real threshold lives. Inside him is the boy who learned to shut down. The man who built identity around control. The wounded self who confused composure with safety. The tender self who still wants love, but does not fully trust what love will ask of him. The ashamed self who fears that if the whole truth is seen, he will lose power. The grieving self who has been carrying far more than he has admitted. When he starts facing these parts, the running changes. He may still pull back outwardly for a time. He may still need silence. Still need space. Still move through fear in imperfect ways. But something essential has shifted. He knows now that what he is dealing with is not outside him alone. He knows the battlefield is within. That is what makes the final shift real. Because before this moment, avoidance still carries a certain innocence. He may believe his distance is practical, his silence is necessary, his hesitation is reasonable. But once he begins seeing that his greatest struggle is with the truths he carries inside himself, avoidance loses some of its disguise. Now it is not wisdom. It is running. Running from his own softness. Running from his own conscience. Running from the emotional honesty that sacred union would require. Running from the version of himself who can no longer stay asleep and still call that life. This is why the final shift often comes after so much pain. Pain removes the easy exits. Pain exposes what the old identity cannot fix. Pain forces him to feel the cost of staying disconnected from himself. And eventually, he reaches a threshold where he is not only tired of the longing. He is tired of being the man who keeps abandoning himself every time truth gets close. That sentence matters deeply. Because the divine masculine is not only wounded by separation. He is wounded by self-abandonment. Every time he chooses silence over truth. Every time he chooses image over honesty. Every time he chooses control over presence. Every time he chooses the old self over what his soul is trying to become. At first, he may not feel that clearly. But by the time the final inner shift begins, he feels it. He feels how expensive it is to keep betraying his own heart. How heavy it is to keep acting against what he inwardly knows. How exhausting it is to live divided. And that is where something profound happens. He starts wanting truth more than he wants escape. Not perfectly. Not all at once. But genuinely. He starts wanting to understand what he feels instead of just suppressing it. He starts wanting to stay with the discomfort long enough to hear what it is saying. He starts wanting to stop running from grief, from tenderness, from vulnerability. From the human parts of himself that the old masculine conditioning taught him to keep hidden. This is not weakness. This is the birth of sacred masculinity. Because sacred masculinity is not a man who never feels fear. It is a man who stops making fear his ruler. It is a man who can look inward without immediately turning away. A man who can admit that his own heart has been waiting for him. A man who stops treating his emotional truth like an enemy and starts relating to it like a doorway. That is what chapter 4 is really about. The final inner shift begins when he stops treating himself as the place he must escape. And that changes the whole journey. Before, the connection may have felt like the source of disruption. Now he realizes the connection only revealed the disruption already living within him. Before, he may have thought the pain came from loving too deeply. Now he begins to understand the pain also came from how long he lived against what that love revealed. Before, he may have believed he needed to protect himself from being hurt. Now he sees that the deepest hurt has come from staying disconnected from his own truth. That realization humbles him. Because now there is no villain to blame. No simple story to hide inside. No easy way to say that everything would be fine if the outer world were different. Now the deeper work is his. His fear. His grief. His silence. His misalignment. His soul. And for many divine masculines, this is the exact place where the final inner war begins ending. Not because the circumstances are solved, but because he stops fighting the fact that the real battle is within. That is what brings union closer. Not merely missing her. Not merely wanting her. Not merely suffering because of the connection. But becoming honest enough to stop running from the self that sacred love came to awaken. And yes, this part can feel like death. Because the self that runs often feels familiar. It feels intelligent. It feels protective. It feels masculine in the old conditioned sense. So to stop running is not just to make a new choice. It is to let an identity lose power. The one who always withdraws. The one who must stay unreadable. The one who trusts distance more than intimacy. The one who would rather be admired than fully known. The one who still thinks self-protection is safer than truth. That version of him cannot lead forever. And the moment he knows that, truly knows that, the final shift is already underway. Because now he has crossed into a different kind of awareness. Not, I am struggling because of this connection. But, I am struggling because I can no longer keep leaving myself behind in order to survive it. That is sacred awareness. And once it arrives, the masculine begins changing in ways that may still be invisible externally, but are enormous internally. He becomes more reflective. More honest with himself. Less impressed by avoidance. Less willing to reduce his feelings into neat explanations. More able to sit inside emotional truth, without immediately trying to outrun it. This is where union begins drawing near in a real way. Because union cannot come to a man who is still fundamentally committed to escaping himself. Union comes closer when the inner escape pattern starts breaking. When the heart stops being the thing he hides from. When his pain becomes a teacher rather than just an inconvenience. When the soul finally has more authority than the old self. And maybe that is the deepest truth of this chapter. The divine masculine does not reach the final shift when he finally stops caring. He reaches it when he finally stops pretending he can live in peace while running from the very parts of himself that sacred love came to awaken. That is when the inner war begins ending. That is when the old distance starts collapsing. That is when the man who once ran from the connection begins realizing he was always being called into something even deeper. A reunion not only with her, but with the self he has been avoiding for far too long. And once he stops running from that self, union is no longer just a hope in the distance. It becomes an inner possibility that has finally begun telling the truth. Chapter 5. He stops wanting control more than truth. There comes a moment before divine masculine union when something subtle but life-changing begins to happen. He stops wanting control more than truth. That is the final inner shift for many men. Not because control disappears overnight. Not because fear vanishes. Not because he suddenly becomes perfectly emotionally open, spiritually enlightened, or free from old wounds. But because the hierarchy inside him changes. For a long time, control sat on the throne. Control over what he showed. Control over what he admitted. Control over how fast things moved. control over how vulnerable he allowed himself to become. Control over how much emotional reality could enter his life before he stepped back, shut down, or created distance. And for a while, that felt necessary. Because control promised safety. It said, if you stay measured, you won't collapse. If you stay guarded, you won't be exposed. If you stay quiet, you won't lose power. If you stay in your head, you won't drown in your heart. This is why the divine masculine often clings to control for so long. It is not always arrogance. Often it is fear organized into a system, a deeply rehearsed system that helped him survive, a structure that gave him identity, a way of staying emotionally functional in a world that may have never taught him how to feel deeply without seeing that as dangerous. So he learns to regulate through control. He controls timing. He controls access. He controls communication. He controls exposure. He controls how much of himself anyone gets to see. And for a long time, this creates the illusion of strength. But sacred union has a way of exposing the hidden weakness inside that illusion. Because control can manage appearances. It cannot create wholeness. It can organize the outer life. It cannot quiet the soul forever. It can help him suppress feeling. It cannot heal what the feeling reveals. That is why, right before union, control begins losing its throne. Not because someone convinces him to let go of it. Because it stops delivering what it promised. The peace it once seemed to bring starts feeling false. The safety it once seemed to provide starts feeling lonely. The identity it once supported starts feeling too small, too rigid, too spiritually expensive to keep obeying. And that is when the deeper question begins rising inside him. What if control is no longer protecting me, but keeping me from the truth? That question changes everything. Because once a man begins asking that honestly, something inside him starts softening. Not in a weak way, in a real way. He begins seeing that much of what he called wisdom was actually emotional management. Much of what he called maturity was sometimes avoidance in a more socially acceptable form. Much of what he called staying grounded was actually staying guarded. That realization is profoundly humbling. Because it forces him to admit that he has not simply been cautious. He has been protecting himself from truths that would have required a completely different version of him to emerge. Truth about what he feels. Truth about what he wants. Truth about how deeply the connection touched him. Truth about the ways his old self has been interrupting what his soul already knows. And here is where the final shift becomes visible. He starts preferring truth, even when truth hurts his pride. That is enormous. Because the old self would always choose control first. Control over discomfort. Control over image. Control over timing. Control over whether he had to feel too much too soon. But the awakening masculine starts realizing that control has become its own prison. That continuing to manage everything is no longer creating peace, only prolonging suffering. So he begins loosening his grip. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Sometimes almost imperceptibly. He becomes more honest with himself. He stops rushing to explain away every uncomfortable feeling. He notices how quickly he used to reach for distance whenever something got too real. He begins seeing that the need to stay in control is no longer the same thing as staying safe. This matters because the final inner shift is not just emotional. It is moral. It is the moment a man begins feeling that living falsely hurts more than feeling deeply. The moment he begins fearing misalignment more than vulnerability. The moment he realizes that if he keeps choosing control over truth, he will lose something much greater than comfort. He will lose himself. That is why Chapter 5 is so important. Because union does not happen when he becomes more emotional than before. It happens when truth becomes more sacred to him than self-protection. That is the hierarchy shift. Before, protect yourself first. Understand later. Now, tell the truth, even if protection cannot come with you in the same way. Before, control the situation so you do not have to feel all of it. Now, feel what is true, even if you cannot control every outcome. Before, preserve your image. Now, preserve your integrity. That last line may be the deepest one of all, because the old self worships image. It wants to look composed, reasonable, measured, unaffected, honorable in the familiar ways. But the soul begins asking for something deeper than image. Integrity. Inner and outer matching. Heart and behavior no longer moving in opposite directions. Truth no longer being privately honored and publicly denied. A life that stops making the soul carry contradictions that the ego finds convenient. This is why the final shift can feel so intense. Because when a man stops wanting control more than truth, he is not simply changing a behavior. He is surrendering an identity. The identity of the one who always manages. The one who keeps himself one step removed. The one who does not need to reveal too much. The one who can hide behind timing, reasoning, and emotional restraint. That identity may have once kept him safe. But now it feels like exile. And once it starts feeling like exile, truth becomes more attractive than control ever was. Not easier. Not safer in the old sense. But more alive. That is the sacred paradox. The divine masculine begins realizing that truth, though frightening, actually contains more life than control. More possibility. More wholeness. More relief, in the deepest sense, than all the carefully managed emotional distance he once relied on. Why? Because truth ends the split. Control keeps the split alive. Control says, feel this privately, but live differently outwardly. Know this inwardly, but do not become it. Long for this, but hide from what it requires. Truth says, no more division. That is why truth becomes more desirable at this stage. Not because it is less painful, because it is less false. And after enough pain, enough silence, enough contradiction, enough exhaustion from carrying the old self, falseness becomes unbearable. He no longer wants to keep performing a version of peace that costs him his own soul. He no longer wants to keep obeying fear simply because fear is familiar. He no longer wants to keep building his life around what keeps him emotionally defended but spiritually hungry. So something changes. He begins listening more closely to what he knows. He begins wanting honesty even if honesty exposes how much he has hidden. He begins valuing authenticity over polished restraint. He begins sensing that real strength may not be in controlling everything, but in allowing truth to reorganize him. That is sacred masculine maturity. Not loss of strength. Transformation of strength. The old strength said, do not let anything touch you too deeply. The new strength begins saying, let what is true touch you and stay. The old strength said, control what you reveal. The new strength says, reveal what you can no longer bear to betray. The old strength said, protect the image. The new strength says, protect the truth. This is why the final inner shift often comes after so much breakdown. Because breakdown strips control of its glamour. It shows him the cost of trying to dominate what was meant to transform him. It reveals that he cannot think, manage, or distance his way into union. He can only become inwardly honest enough that the need for control stops outranking the need for truth. And once that happens, everything begins changing. He may still move slowly, still feel fear, still carry hesitation in places. But the center has shifted. Now when fear speaks, it is no longer the only voice he trusts. Now when control offers its old promises, part of him can hear how empty they have become. Now when truth rises, he does not immediately want to bury it at all costs. That is the sacred shift. Not perfect surrender, but different loyalty. A loyalty no longer given first to self-protection. A loyalty increasingly given to what is real. And maybe that is the deepest question at the heart of this chapter. What happens when a man becomes more afraid of living falsely than of feeling deeply? Everything changes. Because once false living becomes unbearable, truth gains power. Once misalignment becomes intolerable, control loses status. Once the soul is no longer willing to keep paying the price of distance, the masculine begins stepping toward a different kind of life. A life where he no longer needs to dominate every emotion. A life where truth is not postponed until the perfect moment. A life where the heart is not kept outside the door in order for the ego to feel safe. That is union preparation, not a romantic mood, an inner reordering. And this reordering is what makes sacred union possible. Because union does not need a man who has no fear. It needs a man who no longer lets fear outrank truth. It does not need a man with perfect emotional control. It needs a man who has stopped confusing control with integrity. It does not need a man who never hesitates. It needs a man who has become honest enough that hesitation can no longer rule him forever. That is the final inner shift beginning to stabilize. He stops wanting control more than truth. And when that happens, the last defense starts losing its throne, the inner war starts quieting, and the masculine becomes available to something he has longed for all along, but could never truly enter, while still serving the old god of self-protection. A life lived in alignment. That is where union begins drawing near for real. Chapter 6. He feels the full weight of misalignment. There comes a point before divine masculine union when he no longer just feels pain. He feels misalignment. And that is a different kind of suffering. Pain can still be blamed on circumstances, on timing, on distance, on the intensity of the connection, on life being complicated, messy, inconvenient, or emotionally overwhelming. But misalignment is harder to blame on the outside. Because misalignment is the ache of living against what the soul already knows. It is the unbearable tension between what he feels inwardly and how he has been living outwardly. The tension between truth and behavior, between longing and silence, between love and avoidance, between the version of him that knows and the version of him that keeps hesitating. That is why this chapter matters so much. Because the final inner shift before union often deepens the moment the divine masculine begins feeling the full weight of that inner split. Not just noticing it, not just thinking about it, feeling it. Feeling what silence cost. Feeling what delay cost. Feeling what fear cost. Feeling what emotional self-protection cost. Feeling how exhausting it has become to keep carrying two realities inside one body. One reality says, this matters. This is sacred. This is true. The other says, stay guarded. Stay careful. Stay hidden. Stay in control. That split creates suffering. And for a long time, he may have been able to live with that suffering. Not peacefully, but functionally. He may have gotten used to the pressure of it, used to living in contradiction, used to the strange half-life of feeling deeply while acting defensively, used to the emotional tax of knowing something real and still not fully surrendering to what it asks of him. But right before union, something changes. The split becomes too heavy. That is the real shift. Because the soul can only tolerate contradiction for so long once awakening begins deepening. At first, he may still compartmentalize, still tell himself he has reasons, still explain away the distance, still believe the old self can continue managing what the soul is trying to bring into truth. But eventually, the cost becomes undeniable. He starts feeling it everywhere. In the body, in the chest, in the restless mind, in the nights that do not feel restful, in the silence that no longer feels neutral, in the moments when he realizes he is not just missing something sacred, he is actively living out of alignment with it. That is the full weight of misalignment. And it hurts in a way that ordinary longing does not. Because now the pain is not just, I want this. It becomes, I am living against something I know is true. That is much deeper. Because the divine masculine is not only wounded by what he cannot have, he is wounded by what he keeps failing to honor. Wounded by the ways he has gone against his own deeper knowing. Wounded by how long he has let fear lead decisions that his soul has been quietly grieving. This is where conscience becomes louder. Not in a punishing way. In a clarifying way. Conscience begins saying, you know this matters. You know silence is no longer innocent. You know the old excuses are thinning out. You know distance is no longer peace. You know your heart has been trying to tell the truth for a long time. That voice is difficult to silence once it gets strong enough. Because it is no longer just emotional. It is moral, spiritual, existential. Now the question is not just whether he feels enough. Now the question is, How much longer can he live divided from what he knows? That question has enormous weight. Because when a man begins feeling the full burden of misalignment, he is not only confronting emotion, he is confronting identity. He is being forced to look at the version of himself that kept choosing control over honesty, delay over courage, protection over presence. And he is beginning to feel how spiritually expensive that version has become. That is why this phase can feel so heavy. He may suddenly feel grief that seems bigger than the situation, or regret that lingers even when he tries to move on, or a low-grade ache that does not leave, because it is not only about a person, it is about the cost of not living in truth. This is the part almost nobody talks about. The divine masculine does not only suffer because he loves. He suffers because he can feel when his life is out of integrity with that love. That is the full weight of misalignment. It is the ache of knowing one thing in the heart and serving another thing in behavior. It is the pain of sensing that the soul is ready for more while the old self keeps interrupting the movement. It is the exhaustion of trying to preserve an image that no longer matches what is happening inside. And eventually, that exhaustion becomes unbearable. Because inner contradiction drains life force. It drains energy, drains peace, drains authenticity, drains the quiet confidence that comes from living in alignment with what is real. Instead, he begins feeling split. One part of him wants truth. Another part still wants control. One part wants honesty. Another part wants protection. One part wants to stop running. Another part is terrified of what stopping will require. That split is exhausting. And when the soul begins intensifying before union, the split becomes impossible to ignore. He can no longer comfortably call it confusion. He can no longer reduce it to bad timing. He can no longer pretend that what he is feeling is just emotional noise that will settle if he waits long enough. No. He begins realizing that the pain is coming from the gap itself. The gap between who he is being and who his soul is trying to become. That realization is devastating, but it is also sacred. Because once a man fully feels the cost of misalignment, he becomes less interested in preserving it. That is the gift hidden inside the heaviness. Misalignment, once conscious enough, becomes intolerable. He stops admiring his own distance, stops trusting the old reasons, stops glorifying restraint when restraint has become emotional dishonesty, stops calling the split manageable when it is clearly eating at him from the inside. This is when conscience starts deepening into readiness. Because conscience is not just guilt. It is the soul's memory of truth. It is the part of him that remembers what matters. The part that knows what the connection awakened. The part that can no longer be satisfied with excuses that once sounded reasonable, but now feel too thin to carry the weight of what is actually happening inside him. And the more that conscience deepens, the harder it becomes to stay fragmented. This is why the final inner shift often follows a phase of deep emotional heaviness. It is not random heaviness. It is the pressure of the soul against the life that no longer fits. The pressure of truth against habits built by fear. The pressure of alignment trying to be born inside a man who is still partially organized around misalignment. That birth is painful. Because alignment costs him something. It costs the old image. The old control. The old delay. The old permission to keep feeling one thing and living another. And those are not small losses. But neither is the cost of keeping them. That is what he begins to understand. He begins seeing that the pain of change is no longer greater than the pain of staying the same. He begins understanding that the deeper wound is not simply that union has been delayed, but that he has delayed himself from his own truth. He begins realizing that sacred connection is not here just to make him feel intensely. It is here to expose where he is out of alignment. And that exposure can no longer be undone. This is why right before union, the divine masculine often looks more sobered, more humbled, more internally serious. He is not only feeling love, he is feeling the weight of what his own soul can no longer tolerate. The weight of self-betrayal, the weight of contradiction, the weight of how long he has let fear speak louder than truth. And once he feels that fully, something changes. Not instantly in the outer world, perhaps. But inwardly, yes. he becomes less willing to keep defending the split. Less willing to keep calling misalignment just how things are. Less willing to keep living in a way that costs him self-respect at the soul level. That is a sacred turning point. Because the final inner shift before union is not only about love getting stronger. It is about misalignment becoming too painful to continue. That is what pushes him. Not only desire, not only longing, but the unbearable realization that he can no longer keep building a life around what he knows is false without feeling the full cost of it. And maybe that is the deepest truth of this chapter. The divine masculine changes when the inner split stops feeling survivable. When silence costs too much. When fear costs too much. When distance costs too much. When the soul can no longer keep living under the rule of an old self that is misaligned with what matters most. That is when conscience becomes action. That is when heaviness becomes honesty. That is when the full weight of misalignment begins doing what longing alone could not. It makes truth feel necessary. And once truth becomes necessary, union is no longer just something he hopes for. It becomes something he is finally willing to align with. Chapter 7, he shifts from longing for union to becoming able to hold it. There is a profound difference between wanting union and being able to sustain it. And that difference is where the final inner shift truly happens. For a long time, the divine masculine may already long for union. He may miss it, ache for it, think about it, dream about it, replay it in his mind. Feel the pull of it in quiet moments he cannot explain. He may know, at some soul-deep level, that this connection is different, sacred, unfinished, alive. But longing is not readiness. Longing can exist in a man who is still divided. Longing can exist in a man who still chooses silence over truth. Longing can exist in a man who still lets fear outrank honesty. Longing can exist in a man who deeply wants sacred love and still does not yet know how to stay present when sacred love requires him to become more real. That is the painful paradox. Because many people assume that if he wants union badly enough, he must be ready for it. But wanting and holding are not the same spiritual stage. Desire belongs to the heart. Capacity belongs to the whole self. And union does not ask only whether he feels enough. It asks whether he has become someone who can hold what he feels without collapsing back into the old patterns that once made union impossible. That is the shift. At first, he longs for closeness. Later, he begins developing the character to sustain closeness. At first, he wants the connection. Later, he begins becoming someone whose nervous system, conscience, and inner truth can remain steady inside the reality of that connection. At first, he aches for union as an outcome. Later, he begins realizing union is also a responsibility. That realization changes everything. Because the old self often relates to union through desire alone. It wants the relief, the beauty, the emotional completion, the sense of return, the comfort of finally having what the soul has been missing. But the soul is asking for something deeper than emotional reward. It is asking for embodiment. Embodiment of honesty. Embodiment of vulnerability. Embodiment of steadiness. Embodiment of emotional responsibility. Embodiment of a masculinity that no longer disappears every time truth becomes too intense. That is what sacred union actually requires. And this is why the final inner shift is so demanding. Because the divine masculine starts realizing that the issue is never only, do I want this? The deeper issue is, can I hold this without betraying it? That question is holy. Because it pulls him out of fantasy and into readiness. Fantasy says, I want her. I miss her. I feel this deeply. Readiness asks, am I becoming someone who can meet what I feel with truth? Fantasy says, union would heal me. Readiness asks, have I become honest enough that union no longer has to fight my defenses just to stay alive? Fantasy says, I hope this happens. Readiness asks, what in me still makes this impossible to sustain? That is the movement from longing to capacity. And it is often the final shift before outer union begins drawing near in a real way. Because for much of the journey, the masculine may still relate to the connection from a distance. He feels it, yes. He suffers, yes. He may even awaken through the pain of it. But there is still a subtle passivity there, a hope that the existence of love is enough, a hope that longing itself somehow proves readiness. But longing alone does not create union. Longing can be deeply sincere and still remain immature. Not false, not meaningless, but incomplete. Why incomplete? Because longing can still center his need more than his alignment. It can still be about what he wants, what he misses, what he wishes he had not lost, what he hopes will one day return. But capacity shifts the center. Now the focus becomes, can I protect what I claim to love by becoming more truthful? Can I stay instead of retreating? Can I repair instead of hiding? Can I let my inner truth and outer behavior finally begin matching? This is not just emotional change. It is structural change. He begins building a different inner architecture. One that can tolerate vulnerability without immediate shutdown. One that can feel deeply without needing to dominate the feeling through control. One that can admit truth before silence turns into damage. One that can hold love as something sacred rather than something to manage from a distance. That architecture is what makes union possible. Because sacred union is not sustained by feeling alone. It is sustained by presence, by congruence, by the ability to stay emotionally honest when the old self would rather disappear, by the willingness to let love be real enough to change how he lives. And that is why this shift is so significant. He starts realizing that love is not only something he receives. It is something he must become able to carry. Carry through discomfort. Carry through vulnerability. Carry through truth. Carry through his own fear without letting fear run the whole system. This is where many divine masculines become quieter, deeper, more sobered. Not because they feel less, but because they are starting to understand the weight of what they feel. They are beginning to recognize that union is not just an answer to longing. It is a threshold that asks a different kind of man to emerge. A man who no longer confuses silence with strength. A man who no longer glorifies emotional distance. A man who no longer wants control more than connection. A man who can let the feminine remain fully herself without needing to shrink, chase, or carry what he himself must now learn to carry. That is capacity. And capacity is often built through pain. Through realizing what the old self cannot sustain. Through feeling the full cost of misalignment. Through watching the old strategies fail. Through becoming exhausted by a version of masculinity that may have helped him survive, but cannot guide him into sacred union. This is why Chapter 7 is so important. Because this is where he stops relating to union as a dream and begins relating to it as a calling that asks something of him. It asks honesty. It asks surrender. It asks consistency. It asks emotional adulthood. It asks the death of the part of him that still wants love without transformation. And yes, that can feel like a loss. Because the old self wants the beauty of union without the cost of becoming real enough to hold it. But that bargain no longer works. The soul will not let it work. The connection will not let it work. His own conscience will not let it work. So he changes. Not because longing vanished, but because longing matured. It stopped being only ache. It became devotion. Devotion to truth. Devotion to becoming able to hold what he once only knew how to miss. Devotion to ending the split between the man who feels and the man who shows up. That is the final inner shift in one of its deepest forms. He is no longer just asking, when will union happen? He is asking, what must I become so that union no longer has to fight the old self to live inside me? That question marks real readiness. Because now he is not merely waiting for love. He is preparing for it. Preparing by becoming softer where he was hard. More honest where he was silent. More aligned where he was divided. More grounded where he used control as a substitute for truth. More available to intimacy without treating intimacy as danger. This does not make him perfect, but it makes him different. Different in the ways that matter most. He becomes less interested in the performance of strength and more interested in integrity. Less interested in preserving image and more willing to let truth reorder him. Less interested in merely feeling sacred love and more committed to becoming someone sacred love can safely live inside. That is union readiness. And perhaps that is the deepest truth of this chapter. The divine masculine does not reach the final shift simply when he longs enough. He reaches it when longing is no longer enough for him. When he no longer wants only the feeling of union, but the inner capacity to honor it. When he no longer wants only to be loved, but to become the kind of man who can hold love without running from himself again. When he no longer asks only how to reach the connection, but how to stop being the one who interrupts it. That is the movement from desire to capacity. And once that movement begins, union is no longer just a distant spiritual hope. It becomes a living inner preparation, a sacred readiness, a quiet but irreversible becoming. And that is why everything changes. Because at that point, the masculine is not only longing for union anymore. He is finally becoming able to hold it. Chapter 8. Signs the final inner shift is happening. There is a difference between a man feeling more and a man truly changing. A difference between temporary emotion and inner transformation. A difference between missing union and becoming ready for union. A difference between being spiritually affected and being inwardly restructured by what has affected him. That difference matters here. Because the final inner shift before divine masculine union is not just something he talks about. It is something that begins showing up in how he relates to truth, to fear, to silence, to vulnerability, and to himself. So what are the signs? Not fantasy signs. Not wishful thinking. Not surface-level behaviors taken out of context. Real signs. The kind that show the old self is losing authority and something truer is beginning to take its place. The first sign is this. 1. He becomes more honest with himself. Before the final shift, the masculine may still explain everything away. He may call fear timing, distance space, confusion complexity, silence being careful. He may still rely on polished explanations that protect the old identity from full exposure. But when the final inner shift begins, he stops fully believing his own defenses. That is huge. He starts hearing the thinness of the old stories. He starts realizing that some of what he called caution was fear. Some of what he called control was avoidance. Some of what he called strength was emotional exile. He may not say all of this out loud immediately, but inwardly the honesty begins. And inner honesty is the beginning of outer change. Because a man cannot transform while he is still enchanted by his own self-deception. Once that enchantment breaks, the whole system starts becoming more truthful. 2. He stops glorifying distance. This is one of the clearest signs. The old self often romanticizes distance. It treats distance like maturity, like power, like emotional wisdom. It says, see? I stayed detached. I stayed composed. I did not let myself get lost. But right before union, something changes. Distance stops feeling impressive. It starts feeling expensive. He begins to feel the loneliness inside it. The exhaustion. The hollowness. The way it kept him separate not only from the connection, but from his own aliveness. This is a major sign of the final inner shift because once a man stops admiring the defense begins losing its throne. He no longer wants to keep preserving the old image if that image is costing him truth. And that is sacred. 3. He feels softer but more grounded. This may be one of the most beautiful and misunderstood signs of all. A changing divine masculine often becomes softer. Not weaker. Not unstable in the shallow sense. Softer. More emotionally open. More reflective. More affected by truth. Less eager to hide behind the old hardness. But at the same time, he also becomes more grounded. That is the paradox. Because the old self was hard out of fear. The new self becomes soft out of truth. And truth has its own steadiness. So right before union, he may begin feeling less performative, less defensive, less invested in appearing untouched. He may not have everything figured out, but there is a different quality to him now. Less posturing, less emotional pretending, more sincerity. This softness with groundedness is a powerful sign because it means he is no longer relying on armor to feel stable. 4. He becomes less reactive, more truthful. When the old self is in charge, reaction leads. If he feels too much, he withdraws. If he feels exposed, he shuts down. If the connection becomes intense, he reaches for control. But when the final inner shift is happening, the reaction pattern begins slowing down. Not disappearing perfectly, but softening. He becomes more able to stay with discomfort before immediately escaping it. He becomes more reflective before responding. More aware of how quickly fear used to hijack his decisions. More interested in what is true than in what gives him immediate relief. This matters because union cannot be held by a man ruled entirely by reactivity. Union requires presence, and presence begins when reaction no longer has absolute authority. So one of the strongest signs is this. He starts choosing truth over immediate self-protection. 5. He feels the weight of silence differently. Before the shift, silence may have felt useful, protective, even intelligent. After the shift begins, silence changes quality. Now he feels its cost. He begins to understand that silence is not neutral when something sacred is at stake. That withholding truth does not keep him safe in the deeper sense. That silence may preserve image, but it can wound the soul. It can prolong misalignment. It can deepen the very suffering he is trying to escape. This does not mean he instantly becomes verbally expressive. But inwardly, silence stops feeling harmless. That is a major sign. Because once silence loses its innocence, honesty becomes much closer. 6. He starts choosing alignment over ego. This is one of the deepest signs of the final shift. The ego wants to look strong, to stay in control, to avoid humiliation, to preserve image, to never be the one who is too exposed, too vulnerable, too honest too soon. But the shifting masculine begins wanting something else more. Alignment. He wants his inner truth and outer behavior to stop fighting each other. He wants the life he is living to stop contradicting what his soul already knows. He wants to stop being the man who keeps standing in the way of what he himself longs for most deeply. That is a huge movement. Because once alignment becomes more important than ego, the inner war starts ending. The old self may still speak, but it is no longer the only voice that matters. 7. He feels less attached to the old identity. The final inner shift is not just emotional. It is existential. A man begins realizing he does not want to keep being the person he has been, not because he hates himself, but because the old identity feels too small, too false, too exhausting to continue obeying. He stops wanting to be the one who always disappears, the one who always delays, the one who always hides behind control, the one who always chooses safety over truth. This is a massive sign, because the final shift cannot happen while he is still deeply loyal to the old self. It begins when he becomes tired of that self in a soul-level way, when he no longer wants to preserve it just because it is familiar. That weariness with the old identity is holy. It creates space for something truer to rise. 8. He begins relating to the connection with reverence, not just intensity. Earlier on the path, he may feel the connection intensely. He may long, ache, miss, obsess, compare, and be inwardly consumed. But intensity alone is not the final shift. The final shift happens when the way he relates to the connection matures. He begins feeling reverence. Reverence means he no longer treats the connection as something to merely manage emotionally. He starts understanding it as something sacred enough to require truth, honesty, responsibility, and inner transformation. He no longer wants only the feeling of it. He wants to stop being the one who keeps interrupting it. That shift from intensity to reverence is one of the clearest signs of true readiness. 9. He begins taking responsibility without being pushed. A man can feel deeply and still avoid responsibility. But a man who is undergoing the final inner shift begins moving toward responsibility on his own. Not because someone is forcing him, not because circumstances corner him, but because his own conscience becomes too loud to ignore. He starts acknowledging what fear cost, what silence cost, what delay cost, what the old self cost. This kind of responsibility is very different from guilt. It is active, mature, transformative. It means he is no longer merely feeling the consequences. He is beginning to let those consequences refine him. That is a powerful sign that the soul is preparing him for union in a real way. 10. He becomes more available to truth than to escape. This may be the deepest sign of all. At the beginning of the journey, escape is more attractive than truth. Silence is more attractive than honesty. Distance is more attractive than vulnerability. Control is more attractive than surrender. But when the final inner shift begins, this hierarchy changes. Truth becomes more attractive than escape. Even when truth hurts. Even when truth exposes him. Even when truth requires a version of him that the old self never wanted to become. This is the shift. Not that he stops feeling fear, but that fear no longer has the final vote. He becomes more available to truth than to the old refuge of running. And when that happens, sacred union is no longer only an external hope. It becomes an inner reality already beginning to form. These are the signs. Not because they prove outer union will happen on a schedule. Not because they are theatrical, but because they reveal that the masculine is no longer being led by the same self. He is becoming more honest, more aligned, more humbled, more internally congruent, more willing to stop protecting the old identity at the expense of what is real. And perhaps that is the most important truth of all. The final inner shift is not confirmed by one dramatic gesture. It is confirmed when the man who once needed distance to feel safe begins needing truth to feel whole. That is the sign. That is the change. That is the sacred evidence that union is no longer just something he desires, but something he is finally becoming inwardly able to meet. Chapter 9: Why this shift often feels like ego death. The final inner shift before divine masculine union does not usually feel gentle. It feels like death. Not physical death. Not the death of the soul. But the death of the self he has trusted for years. That is why this phase can feel so intense, so destabilizing. So unlike the polished spiritual fantasy people often imagine when they talk about union. Because before the divine masculine can truly align with sacred union, something inside him has to end. The old identity. The old defenses. The old illusion of strength. The old way of relating to love through fear, control, silence, distance, and emotional management. And when those things begin collapsing, the ego does not celebrate. It panics. That is why this shift often feels like ego death. Because the ego does not experience surrender as peace at first. It experiences surrender as threat. The ego says, if I stop controlling, I will lose myself. If I stop hiding, I will be exposed. If I tell the truth, I will lose power. If I become fully vulnerable, I may not survive what comes next. That is the voice of the old self. And for a long time, that voice may have sounded wise, reasonable, protective, necessary. It may have helped him build a life, preserve an image, stay functioning, avoid collapse. It may have convinced him that distance was maturity and emotional restraint was strength. But right before union, that whole structure begins breaking down. And when it breaks down, he does not just lose comfort. He loses identity. That is what makes this so difficult. Because a man can survive a lot of pain if he still knows who he is inside it. What destabilizes him at the deepest level is when pain begins dismantling the very self he used to orient his life around. The self who always stayed composed. The self who could walk away. The self who could suppress what was inconvenient. The self who kept control by never fully yielding to what love was asking him to become. Now that self starts dying. And death, even sacred death, is messy. This is why the final inner shift can look like chaos before it looks like peace. He may feel more emotional than usual. More uncertain. More raw. More exposed. More aware of grief, shame, tenderness, regret, and fear. He may feel like he is losing his footing. And in a sense he is. Because ego death is the loss of false footing. The footing built on control. On image. On emotional distance. On the belief that staying guarded is safer than staying true. Once that footing begins cracking, the masculine often enters a very uncomfortable in-between. He cannot fully go back to the old identity, because it no longer feels alive enough to inhabit. But he has not yet fully stabilized in the new identity either, the one rooted in truth, vulnerability, and alignment. That in-between feels brutal. He may question everything. Who he has been. What strength really means. What love is asking of him. Why the life he built around self-protection suddenly feels so empty. This questioning is part of ego death. Because the ego depends on certainty. It depends on fixed self-images. On roles. On narratives that justify its behavior. On reasons why the old ways were right. But the final inner shift destroys those reasons. Now he can no longer fully believe that silence is harmless. He can no longer fully believe that distance is peace. He can no longer fully believe that control is saving him. He can no longer fully believe that the old self is enough. That is ego death. Not because he becomes worthless. Because he becomes unable to keep worshiping what is false. And that loss of worship is painful. Because false selves do not only protect pain. They organize life. They shape habits. Relationships. Choices. Reactions. Identity. Masculinity itself. So when the false self starts losing its power, the whole inner world shakes. He may feel disoriented, not because he is moving away from truth, but because truth is dissolving the self that once kept him emotionally intact. This is why so many final shifts before union look messy from the outside. He may not appear evolved in a glamorous way. He may appear humbled, broken open, quieter, less certain in the old egoic sense, more human. And that humanity is the point. Because the ego often built its power by denying his humanity. Denying how much he cared. How much he feared. How much he longed. How much he was hurt. How much he needed truth more than performance. Ego death strips away that denial. It brings him face to face with the parts of himself he used to exile. The tender part. The grieving part. The ashamed part. The longing part. The part that wants sacred union, but no longer wants to arrive there as the old guarded self. And once he meets those parts, the illusion of the old identity becomes harder to maintain. That is why this phase often carries grief. Because he is not only grieving a connection. He is grieving the self he has been. The self who lived in half-truth. The self who delayed too long. The self who let fear sit on the throne. The self who confused emotional exile with power. This grief is not punishment. It is release. The release of everything that can no longer come with him into the next stage of his life. The release of the patterns that once felt safe, but now feel spiritually unbearable. The release of the image that cost too much to maintain. The release of a masculinity shaped more by defense than by depth. That is why ego death is sacred. It hurts because something is ending. But what is ending was never the deepest truth of him. It was the armor, the structure, the system, the managed self, the one who knew how to survive without ever fully yielding to what his soul wanted. What remains after ego death is not less masculine. It is more real. A masculine who does not need control as identity. A masculine who can feel deeply without calling that weakness. A masculine who can tell the truth without needing to dominate the room. A masculine who can stop preserving image long enough to choose alignment. This is why the final shift often feels like collapse before union. Because collapse is how the false self experiences truth. Truth does not politely decorate the old identity. It dismantles it. And the dismantling can come with tears, with emotional humility, with sleepless nights, with the unbearable sensation of being stripped down to what is real. That is not failure. That is preparation. Preparation for a different life. A different way of loving. A different way of being a man. The man who enters sacred union is rarely the same man who spent years resisting it. He may carry the same soul, the same heart, the same history. But the inner ruler has changed. Fear no longer has the same authority. Image no longer has the same seduction. Silence no longer has the same glamour. And because those old rulers are falling, it feels like death. But death is not the end here. It is the threshold. The threshold where the false self loses command. The threshold where the soul becomes louder than the ego. The threshold where longing is no longer enough and truth must take over. The threshold where he stops asking, "How do I protect who I've been?" and begins asking, "What in me is ready to become real?" That is ego death. And perhaps the deepest truth of all is this. Ego death feels terrifying because the old self believes it is dying into nothing. But spiritually, he is dying into wholeness. Into a life where love no longer has to fight the old defenses to reach him. Into a life where silence no longer has to carry what truth should speak. Into a life where masculinity is no longer built on emotional absence, but on grounded presence. That is why this shift feels so intense right before union. Because the final inner shift is not a small improvement. It is the ending of the old kingdom. And when kingdoms fall, there is dust. There is chaos. There is grief. There is disorientation. But there is also freedom. Because once the old self has been humbled enough, broken enough, stripped enough, something else begins emerging. Not a perfect man. A true one. A man who does not need the mask. A man who can survive honesty. A man who can hold sacred love without hiding behind the same old strategies. A man who is no longer ruled by the fear that once made union impossible. That is the miracle inside ego death. It does not destroy the divine masculine. It destroys everything that kept him from fully becoming one. Chapter 10. Union begins when the inner war ends. After all the silence, all the avoidance, all the longing, all the inner conflict, all the identity collapse, all the nights where truth felt louder than sleep, we arrive at the deepest truth of this journey. The final inner shift before divine masculine union happens when the inner war ends. Not because every wound is instantly healed. Not because every fear disappears overnight. Not because he suddenly becomes perfect, polished, and spiritually complete. But because something fundamental changes inside him. He no longer wants to protect the old self more than he wants to live in truth. That is the shift. For so long, the war inside him may have looked like this. One part wanted love. Another part wanted control. One part wanted closeness. Another part feared exposure. One part knew the connection was sacred. Another part still trusted silence, distance, and emotional management more than surrender. That war creates suffering. It creates delay, contradiction, restlessness, the exhausting split between what he feels inwardly and what he allows himself to live outwardly. But right before union, something begins settling. Not the outer story first. The inner war. He grows tired of fighting what his soul already knows. He grows tired of defending patterns that no longer protect him. He grows tired of calling fear wisdom, calling silence maturity, calling distance peace. When deep down he knows those things have become the very barriers standing between him and the life his soul is trying to enter. And this is where union truly begins. Not when he reaches her first. When he reaches truth. Because the deepest obstacle was never only external. It was never only timing, distance, confusion, or circumstance. The deepest obstacle was the version of himself that still believed self-protection was more sacred than honesty. Once that belief begins collapsing, the path changes forever. He may still move slowly. He may still feel tenderness, fear, vulnerability, and grief. He may still be human in all the imperfect ways human beings are human. But he is no longer loyal to the same false god. He is no longer loyal to fear above truth. No longer loyal to image above integrity. No longer loyal to control above presence. No longer loyal to the old identity above the deeper life waiting to be born through him. That is why this final inner shift is so sacred. Because the divine masculine does not become ready for union simply by missing it enough. He becomes ready when he can no longer tolerate living in contradiction with it. When he can no longer keep saying one thing inwardly and living another outwardly. When he can no longer keep letting the soul ache while the ego remains in charge. When he can no longer keep protecting the self that keeps wounding what he loves. That is the end of the war. And the end of the war creates a different man. A softer man, but not a weaker one. A more honest man, but not a more performative one. A more grounded man, because he is no longer using emotional avoidance as his foundation. A more trustworthy man, because what he knows and what he does are finally moving toward each other instead of farther apart. This is what sacred union actually needs. Not intensity alone. Not longing alone. Not spiritual language alone. It needs congruence. A man whose heart and actions are no longer enemies. A man whose soul does not have to drag the old self toward truth. A man who has ended the internal rebellion against what love was trying to awaken in him. That is the final inner shift. And maybe that is why it so often comes after so much pain. Because pain stripped him. Pain humbled him. Pain exposed what control could not solve. Pain made avoidance unbearable. Pain revealed the emptiness of the old self. Pain forced him to feel the full weight of misalignment. And once he felt all of that, something deeper became possible. Surrender. Not surrender as weakness. Surrender as alignment. The moment he stops asking, "How do I stay safe?" and begins asking, "How do I stay true?" that is when union gets close. Because once the inner war ends, the soul no longer wastes so much energy fighting the self. Now that energy can move toward integration, toward truth, toward presence, toward the actual embodiment of what sacred love has been trying to call forth all along. This is why the final shift is so invisible and yet so powerful. From the outside, people may only see the result. A softening, a confession, a return, a change in energy, a new depth, a different kind of stillness. But inside him, something far more important has happened. He has stopped making his old wounds the authority. He has stopped making fear the ruler. He has stopped asking the old self to lead him into a life it was never built to hold. That is the miracle. And that miracle does not mean he becomes flawless. It means he becomes available. Available to truth. Available to intimacy. Available to the sacred responsibility of no longer abandoning himself every time love asks for more honesty. That is union preparation at its deepest level. Because union is not simply the reward for longing. It is what becomes possible when the divine masculine is no longer split against his own soul. So if you are witnessing this phase, whether in yourself or in someone you love, remember this. The breakdown was not always the end. The silence was not always emptiness. The delay was not always absence of love. Sometimes all of it was leading to one final sacred threshold. The moment he no longer wants to protect the old self more than he wants to live in truth. That is when the inner war ends. That is when the final shift happens. That is when the divine masculine stops merely wanting union and becomes inwardly ready to meet it. So let this be the reminder for anyone walking through this journey right now. Not every delay is denial. Not every collapse is failure. Not every silence means nothing is changing. Sometimes the soul is doing its deepest work in the hidden places. Sometimes the final shift happens quietly, before the outer world ever catches up. Sometimes union begins the moment a man finally becomes too honest to keep betraying what his heart already knows. And if that truth is touching something in you today, hold on to this. The final inner shift before union is not about becoming perfect. It is about becoming real. If this message resonated with you, comment below. The inner war is over. And tell me, have you ever witnessed the moment when someone stopped resisting their own truth, and everything changed after that? Your story may be exactly what someone else needs to hear. Subscribe for more divine masculine, twin flame, and spiritual psychology content for the soul journey.
Thank you for spending this moment with me. If this message resonated with your soul, remember to subscribe and continue this journey with us here on Twin Flame Journey. And always remember, what is meant for your soul will always find its way back to you. Until next time, beautiful soul, trust the journey.